Good evening. How are you? Good. My name is Chris Alexander. I'm the associate pastor here at Countryside. It's great to have you all out here and see so many faces. I was here last night with Chris Hedges, and he was astounding, as I would have anticipated, and so I'm really looking forward to tonight. I'm glad you're all here. A couple of housekeeping things, just to let you know, if you ever need to use the restroom while you're here. If you go straight out these doors and turn to your left, you go all the way down to that hallway and turn to your left again, and the restrooms are right there. Also, to ask you if you have cell phones on you, now would be a really good time to take them out and turn them off or on vibrate. And we want to say a huge thank you right now to all of the volunteers who help make all these Center for Faith Studies events possible for us, the folks that sell the tickets, the folks that get the cookies and get all that set up, the bookworm who is out there selling books. Thank you all for your support on that, and all the Center for Faith Studies supporters who help keep us going with all these wonderful lectures that we can offer you. The Center for Faith Studies itself has been serving Countryside for over 11 years, and their purpose is to seek to experience God in the world, the here and the now, and to give other people an opportunity to experience God through some of the events that we hold here. So we're hoping and knowing that God is present with us tonight. So taking a deep breath in, we can start to listen for God's voice among us as well. The work of the Center for Faith Studies would not be possible without the ticket sales, so we appreciate your patronage on that. We also appreciate Countryside's support on this and the partial underwriting that we receive yearly from the Sherwood Foundation that makes this all possible. So we thank all of you for being a part of it. Today was kind of a tragic day. As all of you may have already heard, there was a school shooting in Oregon. It's the 45th school shooting this year. All the reason why we need people like Chris Hedges in the world talking to us, right? So let's take a deep breath and just take a moment of silence for the families and the friends that are affected by this, and all of us. Amen. Tonight's event is part of our 2015 season that we have entitled The Mythic Journey, Serving Beauty and Hope in an Everyday World. Our speakers are all kind of unified around the idea of seeing our lives as important in this whole epic human journey that we are all on together. As Joseph Campbell stated, there are no ordinary humans. We all at some time, or many times, find ourselves faced with decisions and opportunities to live as though what we do matters. Chris Hedges is an important part of that journey, and we're so excited to have him with us tonight. Reverend Cynthia Lindemeyer is a good friend of Countryside, a member here. Great supporter and volunteer for Center for Faith Studies, and she personally knows Chris Hedges and helped bring him to us tonight. So we're going to let her do the official introductions. Cynthia?
So it is a great honor, and when I say honor, I want to preface it with like bucket list level honor. To introduce Chris Hedges. He gave me one of the greatest gifts a human being could give another person, and I think that is to help someone really believe in themselves. It was 2008. Chris invited me over to his home, and this was in Princeton, New Jersey. I was working on my doctorate of ministry, and I'm thinking in my mind, okay, he's written all these books, he's a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, and I was a little, he picks me up, and I can't remember what car you had, Chris, but I kind of was praying that the car would make it to his house. It was like that. We got to his home, and it was a modest home, and his wife, Eunice, a great woman who I was astounded by. She went to Juilliard. That's, anyone that goes to Juilliard is like way up here for me. And she's balancing, stirring spaghetti sauce, getting the kids ready for soccer. And we had a 2-hour conversation, and in that 2 hours, I felt like I had come out of the Allegorian Plato cave, where everything I had believed about the Balkan Wars, El Salvador, American history, American democracy, totally unraveled. And that began a very huge journey for me. I see Chris Hedges as a true prophet. He is a voice for the voiceless, and now I've learned he is involved in being a voice for those who are in prison. And I am so excited to hear him speak that I'm going to be quiet and ask Chris to please come up. Would you please give a big welcome?
Thank you very much. Is this on? Yeah. So I'm going to back into the book that I've written, Wages of Rebellion, The Moral Imperative of Revolt. I had written 3 books previously: Death of the Liberal Class, which was originally the idea of an editor at Knopf, and which taught me a very important lesson as a writer: never write somebody else's idea. When I gave them the manuscript, they hated it, and they said they would publish it after they assigned an editor to take out all the negativity in the book. And of course, that didn't go down terribly well, and I called up Nation Books and said, usually get about half your advance up front. And Knopf's a big house. I'd been with Simon & Schuster before. Nation Books is pretty small, but I said, just pay that half, and you can have the whole book. I'd focused primarily on the media, and the collapse. I was a journalist for many years, mostly overseas, 15 years with the New York Times. But in that transition, I realized that all of the pillars of our liberal establishment, and by that I mean those mechanisms that made incremental and piecemeal reform possible, that are so vital to a functioning democracy, have been taken from us. Not just the press, but labor, the sort of the arts community, which has been commercialized, the liberal church, which I come out of. My father was a Presbyterian minister. My mother was also a seminary graduate and a professor. And, of course, the liberal wing of the Democratic Party that had pushed through many of the policies and laws, from the New Deal onward, including the Mine and Safety Act, and much of it written by Ralph Nader, who I worked for in 2008. I was a speechwriter. And I asked how that happened, and it went back to World War I. Dwight MacDonald, a writer I like very much, said World War I was the rock on which the progressive and radical movements were broken. And those radical movements, Chomsky's written quite a bit about this, and I think quite presciently, are vital, have been vital throughout American history, because, of course, as our original system of governance was constituted, most of us were disenfranchised: women, Native Americans, African Americans, even white men without property. And as Cynthia said, I teach in a prison, and one of the games you play in the prison is it's exactly the opposite of teaching at a college. You have to write up a course description which has to pass through the hierarchy of the prison administration, so it has to look absolutely as boring as possible. So I, one year, decided I would teach what I said American history and the Constitution and the 3 branches of government, which the prison authorities approved, and then I bought all of my students Howard Zinn's The People's History of the United States. And, it was a very moving, most of them are African American, it was a very moving book to teach because Zinn is really cognizant of the experience and suffering of African Americans all throughout that book. And I would be giving my 90-minute talk on whatever chapter, and I would hear my students go, "Damn, we've been lied to." It was also moving because when you teach people their own history, their own story, history comes alive. And I remember this was actually in a youth correctional facility, so it means that everybody was under the age of 28. A lot of them came out of gangs, and there was one guy completely covered in gang tattoos. And every week I had them read an original document before we began our class. So I gave him Sojourner's Truth, a great essay, Ain't I a Woman? And he got up and read it, and I went to collect it, and he said, "Can I take it back?" He wanted to put it on the wall of his cell. But that book's important because it showed that all of the spaces that were opened up in American democracy were done so by movements that never took political power. Whether it was the Liberty Party that fought slavery, the suffragists, the labor movement, and maybe the last great expression of that, the civil rights movement, and certainly until he was assassinated in 1968, you could argue that the most powerful political figure in the United States was Dr. Martin Luther King, because when he went to Selma, 50,000 people went with him. The destruction of those movements in the name of anti-communism, and as Dwight McDonald said, the war was the rock on which those progressive movements broke. And we mustn't forget Chautauqua and Rauschenbusch and the social gospel, which was all part of this, all socialists. They ran the largest prison education program in the country. And that's when we saw the rise of modern mass propaganda created by the Wilson administration with the Committee for Public Information, the understanding that people were not moved by fact or reason, but by the skillful manipulation of emotion. We get that today when political candidates are presented to us. Their fictional persona is created quite skillfully, and we confuse how we are made to feel with knowledge. The power of propaganda. Hollywood was churning out one movie after another, The Kaiser, The Butcher, Berlin. The press was completely controlled. And after World War I, all of this vast system of mass propaganda, known as the Creel Commission, because it had been headed by a muckraker named George Creel, former muckraker, went straight to Madison Avenue and began to work on behalf of corporations. So you see, like the father of modern public relations, Edward Bernays, comes out of the Creel Commission. And MacDonald argues that what we entered at that moment was what he calls the psychosis of permanent war. And he said none of the political theorists of the 19th century, including Karl Marx, the only time he writes about war is the Franco-Prussian War, and he hopes the Prussians win because the worker state will come faster, anticipated this constant search for internal and external enemies, which is used quite effectively in the name of communism to destroy the Wobblies, the old CIO, to shut down publications like the Masses, Appeal to Reason. And what we saw was the upending of traditional American values of thrift, of self-effacement, of community, and the inculcation of the cult of the self, the kind of hedonism of the consumer society, which are now, when we speak about what are called American values, those are often held up. But of course they're corporate instilled values, which we're suffering from, I think, tremendously. So that book was a kind of look at the breakdown and ending finally, of course, with McCarthyism. Ellen Schrecker, a great historian, has written a couple books on this that I like very much. No Ivory Tower was the purging. Thousands of professors being purged out of universities, but I didn't know until I read that history that it extended far beyond, of course, the universities into the arts, even at the level of the high schools, so that the FBI would show up, they would have a list of 6 or 7 teachers without any evidence who were supposedly soft or red or whatever, and they would be gone. And that did a tremendous damage to those movements that had acted as a counterweight. I mean, I think as Chomsky correctly points out, the liberal establishment was never designed to be the political left. It was designed to be that force that could ameliorate, as it did during the New Deal, the suffering and grievances of the citizenry, to act as a kind of safety valve. And there's a 1930 letter by Roosevelt where he talks about the importance of addressing what has happened to the working class after the stock market crash. And he said, you know, if you don't do that, you have revolution. So that Roosevelt summed up his presidency by saying that his greatest achievement was that he saved capitalism. And all of those, the Progressive Party, Henry Wallace, all of these figures on the left, of course, contributed to the Public Works Project, the fact that the government employed created 15 million jobs. And I think that's right, that it righted the system at a time of crisis. But with those movements taken away from us, what we then saw was an assault on the liberal establishment itself. So then you began to have purges within the liberal class, whether, you know, even within the ACLU and groups like this. So that by the 1970s, we could argue we'd been utterly stripped of the capacity to resist corporate dominance. And the Harvard historian Charlie Mayer says that at that time, we shifted from what he calls an empire of production to an empire of consumption, meaning that we began to borrow to maintain both an empire and a lifestyle we could no longer afford. And of course, since the 70s, most wages have declined or remained stagnant. What I looked at in that book was essentially what John Ralston Saul, a writer I like very much, he wrote a very fine book called Voltaire's Bastards, Unconscious Civilization, he's a Canadian philosopher, calls a kind of corporate coup d'etat in slow motion. And the other book that I wrote was Empire of Illusion. I look at those 3 books, including this last one, which I have time, I might read a little passage from, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt. Empire of Illusion, The End of Literacy and the Triumph of Spectacle. Totalitarian societies always do spectacle extremely well. They communicate through image. But the danger of being severed from a print-based culture is really about being severed from the world of ideas itself. And one of the things I teach off and on, not only I've taught at several universities, Princeton, Columbia, and what you find with the students, they certainly are conscientious about doing their work, but their frames of reference are not print-based. I remember teaching a class at the University of Toronto and making a reference to Mrs. Jellyby in Charles Dickens' Bleak House, and there was kind of looks across the room, and it turned out that they were all philosophy and religion students. None of them had read Dickens. And it's not that they're not intelligent. They are certainly very intelligent, but on some level they're also illiterate. And I find that very frightening, that, you know, it's important that we know where we came from. It's important that we understand both our intellectual and cultural antecedents and heritage, and that's one of my fears with the war against the arts, where we've essentially eradicated almost all subsidies for the arts. You know, you look at, you know, what's up on Broadway. I mean, they're doing musicals on Broadway based on movies like Rocky and stuff like this. It's, and that's what brings in the money. And of course, you know, all totalitarian regimes, whether it was under Stalin or the Nazis or anyone else, can churn out this kind of fluff. But we need that, you know, we need to protect our cultural patrimony. And then Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, which took myself and Joe Sacco, the great political cartoonist who's really remarkable. There are 50 pages of illustrations where we went to the poorest pockets of the United States and wrote about what I think are termed sacrifice zones, places that have been sacrificed by corporate capital, whether it's the coal fields of southern West Virginia, the produce fields in Immokalee, Florida, Camden, New Jersey, which per capita is the poorest city in the United States, Pine Ridge, South Dakota, where the whole process of imperialism and exploitation began against indigenous peoples. So you saw the cavalry go in, and oftentimes the worst massacres were not even carried out, they were carried out by militias, like Carrington's militia, which carried out the Sand Creek Massacre out of Denver, on behalf of the timber merchants and the railroads and the mine speculators and everything else. And America was unique in terms of imperial powers in that we, in essence, colonized ourselves, and then only after westward expansion was completed, probably ending with the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890, we moved on to the Philippines and Spain in 1898. And I think one of the things that, especially as we face the effects of climate change, we see that, as Karl Marx understood, unfettered, unregulated capitalism is a revolutionary force. It does what it is designed to do, which is commodify everything. The world becomes a commodity. The natural world becomes a commodity. Human beings become commodities that are then exploited until exhaustion or collapse. There's no internal mechanism to halt that. And there's, of course, now no external mechanism to halt that. And that's why the environmental crisis, I think, is intimately twinned with the rise of this neo-feudalism, this rapacious oligarchic elite, where we now see the top 1% will control an estimated 40% of the world's wealth by next year. And those kinds of imbalances are deadly to a democracy. There's a writer that I like very much. He's 92 or 93 now, and he taught at Princeton for many years, taught at Berkeley. His name is Sheldon Wolin. He wrote a book called Democracy Incorporated a few years ago, in which he argues that we live in a system of inverted totalitarianism. And by that, it's not classical totalitarianism. It doesn't find its expression through a demagogue or a charismatic leader, but through the anonymity of the corporate state. So that in a classical totalitarian regime, you have a reactionary or revolutionary party that overthrows a decaying structure and replaces it. But in what he calls inverted totalitarianism, you have corporate forces that purport to pay fealty to electoral politics, the Constitution, the iconography and language of American patriotism, but have internally seized all of the levers of power to render the citizen impotent. And we can go back and look at the trajectory, really, which kind of took off on the Reagan administration, but the Democratic administrations have been complicit in this. So during the Clinton administration, I think you saw the rise of what I would call the faux liberal, the figure who spoke in that traditional feel your pain language of liberalism, but assiduously served corporate power. So under Clinton, you got NAFTA in '94, which was the greatest betrayal of the working class since the 1948 Taft-Hartley Act, which makes it hard to organize. It was under Clinton that you got the omnibus crime bill, which exploded, and the 3 strikes you're outlawed, which exploded our prison population, jumped by almost 700,000. By the time Clinton left office, there were 2 million people who were incarcerated, almost exclusively poor people of color, many of them for nonviolent drug offenses. We're trying to get dealing with corrections authorities is a long and arduous process. And we've been trying to teach in the Supermax prison in Trenton, but they're not. We actually lobbied to get with a lot of groups to get a bill through the state of New Jersey because they were only offering GEDs. If you didn't have a GED, they would have, and then there was nothing. So we got a bill through saying that if there was college courses that would be offered, the prisons had to make them available to the students. The Supermax prison has managed to keep us out. by throwing up rules like saying, okay, all of your students have to come to class shackled, which we won't accept, or you can't teach lifers, as if we're going to discriminate based on sentences. And so I've been trying to go in there. I went in there last summer and taught a course on Shakespeare, and recruited my wife, who taught a course on poetry, and my son, who was a graduate student at Columbia, teach a course on World War I. I mean, just to begin to acclimatize the prison in the hopes that we can. And when I was in there, I was teaching a student who has life plus 55, and he never committed a violent crime. It was weapons, possession, and drugs. And he's never getting out. And this was all really the doing of the Clinton administration. It was Clinton that deregulated the FCC, which profoundly affected my work as a journalist. So you had the ability of a half dozen corporations, Viacom, General Electric, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, News Channel, Disney, to consolidate the hold so that thousands of stations, probably 90% at this point of what Americans hear on the airwaves, is controlled by just a handful of corporations. And they're different from the old media monopolies. So it's not like Hearst newspapers. These are corporations for which the media is just one revenue stream out of many revenue streams. And they have to perform by competing against other revenue streams. And that's decimated journalism on the commercial airwaves, and really, in essence, destroyed it. When I began as a reporter in El Salvador in the early 1980s, all of the networks had producers, reporters. They would go out, they would produce 3 to 5 minutes. It's all vanished. It's all gone. And you look at the kind of formula of nightly news, the lifestyle stories, the kind of feel-good stories, it's just the infection of kind of the Today Show upward. Neil Postman wrote a very fine book about this. Actually, I think it was 1985. He kind of got it very early, called Amusing Ourselves to Death on the news, and it's a really brilliant book. And so Clinton had a profound effect in terms of how we get our information. It was Clinton that destroyed the traditional welfare program, and under our old welfare program, 70% of the recipients were children. And it was Bill Clinton, of course, who reversed the 1933 Glass-Steagall Act that created firewalls between investment and commercial banks. That was all Clinton. Clinton had a kind of diabolical brilliance. By the 1990s, the Democratic Party, in terms of corporate money, had fundraising parity with the Republicans. I think you could argue that he kind of transformed the Democratic Party into the Republican Party, and he pushed the Republican Party so far to the right, as we now see it, became insane. But those mechanisms by which the citizen had been able to create reform were taken from us. And the person who really kind of tutored me in this was Ralph Nader, who knows more about corporate power and has been fighting it longer than probably any other American. He's written 24 pieces of legislation, including the Mine and Safety Act, OSHA, Clean Water Act, all of that Nader wrote, and then it was pushed through the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, which used to challenge, if you remember, weapons systems, which are now unchallengeable. And I think that that's why there's almost on all of the major issues, not in terms of identity politics, but on all of the structural issues, whether it's about empire, whether it's about Wall Street and civil liberties, there's almost complete continuity between the Bush administration and the Obama administration. In fact, Obama's assault on civil liberties, I speak as a journalist, has been worse than under President Bush, including the passage of the Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act, which overturns over 150 years of domestic law and permits the U.S. military to carry out policing on the streets of American cities, to seize American citizens who, quote unquote, substantially support, that's not a legal term, that's not material support, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or something called associated forces, which is another nebulous term. And hold them indefinitely in military facilities without due process. So he signed this bill into law at midnight on New Year's Eve 2011, obviously sort of hoping people wouldn't notice, and with two great lawyers, I sued him in the Southern District Court of New York, and we won, and Judge Catherine V. Forrest issued a temporary injunction. And what was, we knew that the Obama administration would appeal, but what was surprising was how aggressively they reacted. So she wrote her 112-page opinion, came out, the ruling on a Friday. It's quite a fine opinion. I mean, she talks about how this opens the way for the government to criminalize an entire category of people, and she actually talked about the 110,000 Japanese Americans who were interned in World War II. And not only did the federal attorneys appear in our chambers, but they now came with NSA attorneys. I debated them at the Oxford Union a couple years later, and we won. It's on YouTube. Everything's on YouTube. In black tie. I went to Harvard, and I thought Harvard, boy, I tell you, Oxford British snobbery wins the prize. It made Harvard University looked just humble, and to her credit, she didn't back down. And then at 9 in the morning on that next Monday, they went to the appellate court and put in the same plea, that you have to reverse the temporary injunction in the name of national security, which unfortunately the appellate court did. And we wondered why. Why did they act so swiftly? And I think our feeling was that it's probably because they're already using the law, i.e., there are probably dual U.S. Pakistani nationals in black sites like Bagram, and if any of them got out while that injunction was in place, they could sue the government for contempt of court. And what happened in that case is what's happened, I think, throughout our judiciary, which has failed us, where we have seen our constitutional rights overturned by judicial fiat. The fact that the courts have not stood up for our right to privacy, the fact that we are the most watched, surveilled, monitored, eavesdropped population in human history, and I speak as a reporter who covered the Stasi state, the collapse of the Stasi state in East Germany. When your government watches you 24 hours a day, you cannot use the word liberty. That is the relationship of a master and a slave. And what happened is the appellate court, didn't want to rule because it is clearly unconstitutional to use the military as a policing force and to carry out acts of extraordinary rendition on the streets of American cities. And so we went before the panel. It's a panel of judges. And then months and months went by, and it didn't issue a ruling, didn't issue a ruling, didn't issue a ruling. And I had been also a plaintiff before the Supreme Court in a case called Clapper versus Amnesty International. This was challenging the warrantless wiretapping. It was before the Snowden revelations. So what happened was the government lawyers got up in court and charged that those of us who had brought the case, it was just speculation that we were being monitored by the government. And then they had the audacity to tell the Supreme Court that if, in fact, we were being monitored, the government would tell us. So they threw the case out saying that we didn't have the standing to bring it, and then the appellate court said, well, he doesn't have standing in Clapper versus Amnesty International, so he doesn't have standing in Hedges versus Obama, but they never ruled on the fact that they've taken our privacy from us. So we've seen that over and over. We saw it with Citizens United, as if unlimited corporate cash, which have now distorted our election process to the point where money, in many cases, in most cases, perhaps replaces the vote, is the right to petition the government, is free speech. This is utterly upending what the authors of the Constitution intended. And that brings me to Wages of Rebellion, the moral imperative of revolt. Like many of you, I read all the climate change reports. Each one is more dire than the last. Climate scientists repeatedly say that the rate of acceleration and deterioration, whether in the oceans, whether in the polar ice caps, whether glaciers, is far greater than they had anticipated. And yet, we continue to allow the fossil fuel industry to ravage. And I just came from Canada, where the tar sands are, of course, have taken over thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of acres. There's no check. There's no ability of our, to impede. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about the NDAA case is that in the midst of that 2-year legal battle, they ran a poll and they found that 97% of Americans were against it, but it passed anyway. And this goes all the way back to the 2008 bailouts. Constituent calls were 100-1 against the bailouts across the political spectrum, and yet it passed anyway. Repeatedly, what we as citizens demand as our rights or request are irrelevant within a system that is, I think as Wolin correctly points out, completely hostage to the dictates of corporate power. You have the whole specter of these trade agreements, the TPP and CAFTA, where we're not allowed to see them. And not only that, our elected officials, if they see them, are not allowed to speak about them. Even if they take notes, those notes are confiscated. From what little we have gotten through WikiLeaks primarily shows that this will have devastating effects in terms of our ability to regulate the environment, to protect workers' rights and conditions. It is a further eroding away of national sovereignty, of our control over our own lives. With, in particular, NAFTA, we, of course, have seen manufacturing largely flee overseas. One of the few things we make anymore are weapons. 40%, we sell 40% of the worldwide, we're responsible for 40% of the worldwide arms trade. But like all imperial powers, and I studied, I have a Master of Divinity from Harvard, but I then went on and did a fellowship at Harvard in classics. And it's right out of Gibbon, who wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, that when empires collapse, and there's a really fine study of this, a little academic, but it's really smart. It's called The Collapse of Complex Societies by Joseph Tainter, who looks at the collapse of 24 of the world's greatest civilizations to determine the patterns by which they go down. And one of the primary patterns is that empire expands beyond its capacity to sustain itself. And so, in essence, what it does is hollow the country out from the inside. And you probably don't have to drive very far to know exactly what I'm talking about. Our infrastructure is crumbling. I take that Northeast Corridor Amtrak between Washington and New York and Boston, and there are literally moments where the tracks are like at a 40-degree angle. We're all kind of tipped to the side going about probably 30 miles an hour or something. I don't want to denigrate Bolivia. I used to live there, but I feel like I'm on a train in Bolivia. Libraries are shut. Schools are closed. Social service programs are eviscerated. And we are funneling resources. The trillions of dollars we have funneled into the wars in the Middle East. And let's be clear, we've lost the war in Afghanistan. Iraq as a unified country is never coming back. But of course, for a certain segment of America, i.e. the defense contractors, war, as it has always been, is an extremely good business. Their stocks have all quadrupled since 9/11. In the attack on Libya, they dropped, I think in the first few days, 161 Tomahawk cruise missiles on Libya. Each cruise missile cost $1.41 million. That, in just a couple days, we just blew $500 million. And I think if anybody's around in a few decades to write the history of American empire, they will ask, why? Why trillions upon trillions? I mean, the estimates are that between all of these wars, we're spending perhaps $1.6 trillion. You know, a lot of the budgets we're not allowed to see. The intelligence budget, which we estimate is $100 million, is secret. There are all sorts of black budgets. We officially spend about 54% of our discretionary spending on the military. That doesn't count Veterans Affairs. It doesn't account for the nuclear weapons program. And they've just passed a bill, I think $350-some billion over 10 years to refurbish our nuclear weapons. We're building 12 new Ohio-class submarines at $8 billion apiece. I don't think ISIS even owns a rowboat, so I'm not sure what it's going to be used for. But it doesn't matter. I mean, we had the Raptor, I think they're F-22s. Even the Pentagon said, we don't want them, we don't need them, but the contractors rule. You know, A. Philip Randolph had it. He said, if you want to save your country and you want to, I'm with Plato that only the dead have seen the end of war. I mean, I spent so much in war, I have obviously a very dark view perhaps of human nature, so I don't know that world peace will ever come, but certainly if you want to curtail war, you take the profit motive out of it. And I think that's right. I don't think that part of our manufacturing industry, that should be completely nationalized. People should not be profiting off of weapons. But what you're doing is you're draining all of our resources. Really, you're just squandering it. I mean, nothing good is coming out of what's happened in Iraq. And I spent 7 years in the Middle East. I was the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. As some of you may know, I ran afoul of my employer because I was denouncing Bush's call to invade Iraq. For all of the Arabists, were in agreement that this was just utterly. I mean, first of all, aside from the fact that Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11 and was not a threat to us, much less its neighbors, its military was completely degraded. He couldn't run his tanks, and I covered the UN inspection teams that had really the wars on Iraq created, I think you could argue it's probably the most disastrous strategic decision ever taken by the United States. I mean, we find ourselves today, if you look closely, actually empowering the very forces that we set out to destroy. We have become Bashar al-Assad's air force. Remember, Hezbollah fighters are integrated into Syrian armed forces. We are Hezbollah's air force. Iran has become completely ascendant, and we now have a tacit alliance with Iran, both in Afghanistan and Iraq. And we have created ISIS. When you brutalize people for 12 years like that, they become brutal. Just as the saturation bombing of Cambodia produced Pol Pot, the constant attacks coupled with our decision to dismantle the Iraqi state has created out of these failed states these horrific and very frightening groups. But I think what we don't see, and if you remember a few months ago, ISIS captured a Jordanian pilot and put the pilot in a cage and burned the pilot alive. But what we don't see is all of the families that, our 1,000-pound iron fragmentation bombs and Hellfire missiles have incinerated. You get this kind of very bloody and horrible kind of quid pro quo that's going back and forth. It's why these prisoners who are beheaded are dressed in the orange jumpsuits that prisoners on Guantanamo wear. I think what's frightening for those of us who come out of the Middle East is that it's the indiscriminate use of violence that has created this. And yet the response is more violence. And now, of course, we're watching the Russians intercede in Syria, which adds a whole other very frightening mix. So what you're watching is at a moment when climate change should be declared a national emergency. We know that the official figures on unemployment are cooked because people are dropped from the rolls after a certain period of not looking for work. The Los Angeles Times about a year ago ran a story where they estimated that real unemployment is probably about 17%. I've actually seen figures as high as 20%. But then you have chronic underemployment. So the average worker at Walmart works 28 hours a week, but their salary puts them below the poverty line. And when they get their job, they are given applications for food stamps because they qualify. So we get to sort of subsidize the Walton Foundation or family fortune, who I read the average family member makes $11,000 an hour. All of this is, Nader says of these corporations, he calls them traitors, and I think he's right. I think that, they're supranational. We have $18 trillion that they've stored overseas in tax havens. They have all sorts of subsidies, not just the bailouts, but they're borrowing money at 0.8% interest from the Fed. They do what all powerful corporations that have monopolies do, which is actually destroy the free market, which never really exists except in the mind of a true believer like Alan Greenspan. But the New York Times ran an editorial about the whole fixing of international rates for 7 years. They were given, the largest banks were given, forced to pay a fine of $9 billion, but in the Times editorial, they said they made 86 or $89 billion, so it was a great deal. The fact that we allow them to borrow money at such a low interest rate, this is actually from Bloomberg News, allows these corporations to, in the words of Bloomberg News, in essence funnel taxpayer money directly to their shareholders. And they said if that kind of subsidy was taken away, these big banks would barely break even. I mean, these are hardly, this isn't from Mother Jones. I mean, these are hardly radical. And so, we are at a very frightening moment. And what happens in empire, and Thucydides actually writes about this with the collapse of the Athenian Empire. So Athens becomes an empire and takes over, huge areas of around Greece, and what Thucydides writes is that the tyranny Athens imposed on others, it finally imposed on itself. That what destroyed Athenian democracy was empire. And we are watching, and I speak as someone who spent 2 decades on the outer reaches of empire, all of the harsh and violent forms of control that are used on the outer reaches of empire are being visited now within the heart of empire. So we've got militarized police forces. The Washington Post estimates that perhaps as many as 2 people a day are being gunned down in the streets of American cities. Most of them are unarmed, most of them poor people of color. We have got the arrival of drones for local law enforcement. We have, of course, wholesale surveillance, and we have the evisceration of our traditional civil liberties, so that the tools of control that are intimately familiar in Fallujah are now becoming more and more familiar in Omaha and everywhere else. And that's exactly what happens with empire, so that these forces, in essence, cannibalize the country. And then they use the mechanisms of control that they have perfected on the edges of empire to keep a restive population under control. And one of those mechanisms is mass incarceration, where we have 2.3 million people incarcerated, 75,000 in solitary confinement, and if you spend months in solitary confinement, you psychologically break down. Very, very few people do not. And if you want to get a sense of what it's like to be in solitary, go home and lock yourself in your bathroom for the weekend. We have endemic violence within the prison system, which is unchecked. And we have a court system that doesn't function. So 94% of everyone in our prison system never had a trial. They're forced to plea out. And the students that I teach with the longest sentences are those who went to trial. And unfortunately, they had a public prosecutor. It's not the fault of the public prosecutors. They're overwhelmed. They get to spend 15 minutes. What they do is stack you with all sorts of charges, 18 charges or something, and then they'll take 8 of them off is how it works. So you kind of bargain like that with the prosecutor. But if you go to trial, you're going to get hit with all of them. And some of my students with the longest sentences are the ones I know that didn't commit the crime because they tried to make the system work on their behalf. I have a student, it's just case after case, but I have a student who was picked up at the age of 14. He was homeless. His mother had been beaten to death by his stepfather. He actually cradled his mother's head in his arms as she died. He ends up running on the streets, ends up with a gang. He's a kid, a 90-pound kid. And there's a knifing, and the police grab him, and they pull him into the police station in Camden, and they won't let him go home. It's 2 a.m, he's weeping, there's no one there. They're saying, sign, sign, sign. He signs. Between the ages of 14 and 16, he's on the top floor of the Camden County Jail with adult charged felons. At 16, he goes to trial. He's charged as an adult, and he is not allowed to go before a parole board until he's 70 years old. He's my best student. I'm not a pushover too much in there. He was my only A+ last spring. I taught a course on conquest. This is the benefit of living in an illiterate society. I taught Open Veins of Latin America, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and C.L.R. James's Black Jacobins. And at the end of the semester, if I would mention a book, like Wolin, I worked with a local bookstore to build them a library of 1,000 books. They had when I got there, their research library, which they had tried to put together themselves, had 11 books. And I remember, I wasn't sure I was going to get all those books in, and I have to take it down myself and get them x-rayed, and I feel like step and fetch it with the guards, and I'm always pleasant no matter how awful they are. I have to take a Tylenol when I leave. And I got my first shipment of 200 books in, and I told my class, well, the good news is I just got 200 books in for your library. The bad news is I picked them out. So it's Nietzsche, Kant, Freud, and you know what? They were ecstatic, because if you care about the life of the mind, those kinds of books are utterly unavailable to you. So when you finish your class, you have to get in line in the corridor very quickly when the bell goes off, otherwise you get what's called a charge. And so he waits till everyone's out of the classroom. This is the student who was taken at 14. And he said, I know I'm going to die in this prison, but I work as hard as I can so that one day I can be a teacher like you. And he walks out. I helped them write a play last year. I was teaching drama. I always teach something different. It's kind of fun for me. It's more work. I'm teaching Chekhov this fall. That's partly because my good friend Cornel West worships Chekhov and knows everything about Chekhov. He knows everything about everything, but he knows everything about Chekhov. And I once, which was a really bad idea, got into a dinner debate with him as to who was a greater writer, Dostoevsky or Chekhov. I was taking Dostoevsky, he was taking Chekhov. So now I'm going to really master Chekhov. And I have Chekhov's biography in my hotel room, which I'm reading. But I was teaching drama. So I was teaching August Wilson, who's really an amazing playwright, and Dutchman by Leroy Jones, later Amira Baraka, and Go Tell It on the Mountain by Baldwin. And so I said to the class, okay, we'll do an experiment. We'll have you write scenes, dramatic scenes from your own life. And I took 28 students. The first week, I took those papers home, and it always has this peculiar kind of musty smell from the prison. And I'm reading through, and I get to the third or fourth scene, and it's brilliant. I read on, there's another one that's brilliant. And what had happened is it had gotten out that I was a writer. And so I had attracted the best writers in the prison. That happens 2-3 weeks later, and I said, I told my wife, maybe I can do something with this. So I was supposed to be writing the book, Wages of Rebellion. I dropped it. I added another night every week. You can only add another night. The rules are you can add another night if your students need remedial help. So I went into my class and I said, well, we're adding Friday night for remedial help. And they said, how many of us? I said, all of you are coming on Friday night for remedial help. And I spent 4 months helping them write this play, which was about their lives. And we're working now with a theater company to put it up in New York next year. But the stories were staggering. I remember one night, and I mentioned this the other night, I said, okay, next week you have to write a dialogue or a dramatic scene about you and your mother. Just something you remember of a conversation or a moment with your mother. And so one of my students said, well, what if we're a product of rape? And I said, well, Timmy, that's what you have to write. So he comes in, and this is what he writes, which is autobiographical. He's in a car in Paterson, New Jersey, and he's with his half-brother. And the car is pulled over by the police. And his half-brother has a pistol in the car. Now, if nobody in the car claims the weapon, then everyone's charged with weapons possession. And Timmy says, it's mine. And what he writes was the phone call from the jail that says, it doesn't matter, Ma. I was never supposed to be here anyway. You have the son you love. That's why he's in prison. And when we were going to read the play, we couldn't perform it because it's tough, it's real. I invited Cornel West and the great theologian James Cone, and if you've not read The Cross and the Lynching Tree, it is one of the most important books, probably in the last 2 decades, theological books, to come be our audience. And when we got to the lobby, the warden was there. And he said, you're not going to your classroom, you're going to the chapel. So we went to the chapel, and there was not only the warden, but about 12 corrections officers and the major, who was the highest uniformed official in the prison. And we, of course, couldn't read the play, the whole play. And they all kind of huddled to decide what they could read, but they read Timmy's part. And when the reading was over, I looked around. They're all huge. All they do is lift weights, so I'm like one of the munchkins, in there. And I looked around. Timmy was about 6'4". I said, where's Timmy? And they said, he's in the bathroom. And I went, and this had never been public. And he was just seated in the corner, shaking and weeping. August Wilson's right. You find the best and the worst inside the prison. What you find in there in terms of integrity and intelligence, a thirst to learn. It's why I will never leave a prison until they throw me out. And they may throw me out. Gave them the syllabus this spring, my students, and I was in Montana giving a talk, and in my hotel room I got a phone call, and it said, this is the Special Investigations Division of the Department of Corrections of New Jersey. Do you know that your students just led a sit-down strike in Rahway Prison? I didn't know and they said, we think you're behind it. I was so proud of them. Really. Talk about courage. They knew what was going to happen, but they stood up anyway. And of course, they were interrogated, and at the whim of a corrections officer, your college program is gone, your job is gone, even though you make only $1.30 a day, which means you're locked. The big problem that means you're locked in your cell most of the day. You can be sent to solitary. They brutalized my students until they found the ringleaders, and they shipped them off to another prison and put them in solitary. And I had to go the next week to be interrogated. Unfortunately for them, as a foreign correspondent, I had lots of practice being interrogated by not very bright police and military around the globe. And I got back into the prison, but they were in the trauma was just, it was really drove home to me the tremendous stress that they live under. They were really broken and frightened, and you have nothing in a prison. And so there was this silence. They thought they'd never see me again. And one of them said, "We're going to get you a cup of tea." Now, that's a big thing in a prison, because you've got to get boiled water, you've got to get a cup, and you've got to get a tea bag. And so one of them went down, they brought back, and they gave me that cup of tea. I think that moment in the prison is kind of what I was attempting to get at Wages of Rebellion, that we live in a very frightening time. Things are unraveling. We watch this horrible act of nihilistic violence today in Oregon, the 45th school shooting in our country. We are watching those who are treated like human refuse, whether in the Middle East with ISIS. 30,000 foreign fighters are now with ISIS. That neoliberal ideology of trickle-down economics has been exposed as a lie. The very forces of kind of unfettered corporate capitalism have proven to be the enemy of democracy. And those of us, especially those of us who have children, have to stand up. I was very involved in the Occupy movement. I went to jail. I was arrested in front of Goldman Sachs. I don't like going to jail. It's more time than I care to donate to the U.S. government. But I want my children to look back and say that at least their dad tried. And when I write that book is different from the other books, in that it's not prescriptive. It says we must stand up, that resistance is a moral imperative. I was around violence my whole life. I'm fervently nonviolent, but militantly nonviolent, if it's possible to be militantly nonviolent. And I think that, when we stand up and speak truth to power, we have the capacity, if we have the courage to speak that truth, to be effective. I covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe. So I was in Leipzig when it was all begun by Lutherans. Somebody's a Lutheran here, right? There you go. It was all Lutherans in Leipzig. And it began with, Lutherans with candles, and not many of them. I mean, maybe a dozen, maybe a couple dozen, marching through the streets, and then suddenly by September of 1989, it was 70,000 people. And Erich Honecker, the dictator, sent down an elite paratroop division to shoot the crowd. And when those elite paratroopers got to Leipzig, they put down their guns. And Honecker was out of power within a week. He'd been in power for 19 years. The Stasi state was the most effective security and surveillance state probably in the world, dwarfing even the Soviet Union. I covered the revolution in Prague with Václav Havel. I spent every evening in the Magic Lantern Theater with Havel, Dinsbier, Klaus, all the people who would inherit the government. And there were posters all over the city of a young Charles University student named Jan Palach. And to protest the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968 and the overthrowing of Dubček, he had gone to Wenceslas Square and lit himself on fire. He died 4 days later of his burns. The students who marched in his funeral procession were broken up by the police. It was a non-event, of course, in the state media. And when his grave became a shrine, the communist government exhumed his remains, cremated them, gave the ashes to his mother, and said she wasn't allowed to rebury them. 2 weeks after the communist government collapsed, 10,000 people marched to Red Army Square and renamed it Jan Palach Square. I was also in Wenceslas Square with 500,000 Czechs when the great Czech singer Marta Kubasheva walked out on the balcony. She, in 1968, had broadcast over the airwaves as the Soviets were invading an anthem of defiance called A Prayer for Marta. And the response was, after the pro-Soviet regime was installed, that her entire recording stock was destroyed, she was banned from the airwaves, and she had spent the intervening years working on an assembly line in a toy factory. She walked out on that balcony, and she began to sing the prayer for Marta. And every Czech in that crowd knew every word. That is the power, the moral power of resistance. The capacity to stand up, what Auden calls that ironic point of light, wherever the just exchange their messages. That's what Václav Havel wrote about in his 1978 essay, The Power of the Powerless. That when you have the courage to stand up and speak that truth, even those within the apparatus hear that truth. All revolutions, despite the myth, are nonviolent. I mean, you can have wars of independence like in Algeria, but the revolutions are not. The Tsar had to abdicate when the Cossacks were sent into Petrograd and refused to fire on the crowd. That was true when the military, the fourth or fifth largest military in the world under the Shah, refused to defend the discredited regime. That was true in Cuba. That was true. And I think that we, especially people, and I know many of you, like I do, come out of a faith tradition, it is incumbent upon us, especially because we are squandering the future for our children, to resist. And the book is really about that call, that resistance is finally not carried out for what it can achieve, but for who it allows us to become. I don't fight fascists because I'll win. I fight fascists because they are fascists. And that is the moral imperative of standing up against what Immanuel Kant calls radical evil. And as Kant said, if justice perishes on earth, life has lost its meaning. I'm going to close by reading a little passage from Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt. And it's a moment when I and Occupy protesters marched on Goldman Sachs. It's a great picture. I've given up long ago trying to look hip, so I walk down the street in a Brooks Brothers button-down shirt, surrounded by kids who are pierced and mohawks and tattoos, and I love them. I love them. They're our hope. Black Lives Matter, the anti-frackers, and I'm leaving actually tomorrow to go to Denver to speak to it's all groups of kids in their 20s who around the country are gathering in the anti-fracking movement. So this is from that moment. Faces appeared to me. Moments before protesters from Occupy Wall Street and I were arrested on a windy November afternoon in front of Goldman Sachs. They were not the faces of the smug Goldman Sachs employees who peered at us through the revolving doors and lobby windows. They were not the faces of the blue uniformed police with their dangling plastic handcuffs, or the thuggish Goldman Sachs security personnel whose buzz cuts and dead eyes reminded me of the Stasi. They were not the faces of the demonstrators around me, the ones with massive student debts and no jobs, the ones weighed down by their broken dreams, the ones whose anger and betrayal triggered the street demonstrations and occupations for justice. They were not the faces of the onlookers, the construction workers who seemed cheered by the march on Goldman Sachs, or the suited businessmen who did not. They were faraway faces. They were the faces of children dying. They were tiny, confused, bewildered faces I had seen in the southern Sudan, Gaza, the slums of Brazzaville, Nairobi, Cairo, Delhi, and the wars I covered. They were faces with large, glassy eyes above bloated bellies. They were the small faces of children convulsed by the ravages of starvation and disease. I carry these faces They do not leave me. I look at my own children and cannot forget them, these other children who never had a chance. War brings with it a host of horrors, but the worst is always the human detritus that war and famine leave behind. The small, frail bodies whose tangled limbs and vacant eyes condemn us all. The wealthy and the powerful, the ones behind the glass at Goldman Sachs, laughed and snapped pictures of us as if we were an odd lunchtime diversion from commodities trading, from hoarding and profit, from the collective sickness of money worship, as if we were creatures in a cage, which in fact we soon were. Goldman Sachs Commodities Index is the most heavily traded in the world. The financial firm hoards futures of rice, wheat, corn, sugar, and livestock, and jacks up commodity prices by as much as 200% on the global market, so that poor families can no longer afford basic staples and literally starve. Hundreds of millions of poor in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America do not have enough to eat in order to feed this mania for profit. The technical jargon, learned in business schools and on trading floors, effectively masks the reality of what is happening: murder. The cold, neutral words of business and commerce are designed to make systems operate, even systems of death, with a ruthless efficiency. The people behind the window, and those of us with arms locked in a circle on the concrete outside, did not speak the same language. Profit, trade, speculation, globalization, war, national security. These are the words they use to justify the snuffing out of tiny lives, acts of radical evil. The glass tower before us was filled with people carefully selected for the polish and self-assurance that come with having been formed in institutions of privilege. And their primary attributes are a lack of consciousness, a penchant for deception, aggressiveness, a worship of money, and an incapacity for empathy or remorse. It is always the respectable classes, the polished Ivy League graduates, the prep school boys and girls who are the most susceptible to evil. To be intelligent, as many are, at least in a narrow, analytical way, is morally neutral. These respectable citizens are inculcated in their elitist ghettos with values and norms, including pious acts of charity used to justify their privilege and a belief in the innate goodness of American power. They are trained to pay deference to systems of authority. They are taught to believe in their own goodness, unable to see or comprehend, and are perhaps indifferent to the cruelty inflicted on others by the exclusive systems they serve. And as norms change, as the world is steadily transformed by corporate forces into a small cobble of predators and a vast herd of human prey, these elites seamlessly replace one set of values with another. These elites obey the rules, they make the system work, and they are rewarded for this. In return, they do not question. We seem to have lost, at least until the advent of the Occupy Wall Street movement, not only all personal responsibility, but all capacity for personal judgment. Corporate culture absolves all of responsibility. This is part of its appeal. It relieves all from moral choice. There is an unequivocal acceptance of principles such as unregulated capitalism and globalization as a kind of natural law. The steady march of corporate capitalism requires a passive acceptance of new laws and demolished regulations, of bailouts in the trillions of dollars, and the systematic looting of public funds, of lies and deceit. The corporate culture epitomized by Goldman Sachs has seeped into our classrooms, our newsrooms, our entertainment systems, and our consciousness. This corporate culture has stripped us of the right to express ourselves outside of the narrow confines of the established political order. We are forced to surrender our voice. Corporate culture serves a faceless system. It is, as Hannah Arendt wrote, the rule of nobody. And for this very reason, perhaps the least human and most cruel form of rulership. Those who resist, the doubters, outcasts, artists, renegades, skeptics, and rebels rarely come from the elite. They ask different questions. They seek something else, a life of meaning. They have grasped Immanuel Kant's dictum, if justice perishes, human life on earth has lost its meaning. And in their search, they come to the conclusion that, as Socrates said, it is better to suffer wrong than do wrong. This conclusion makes a leap into the moral. It refuses to place a monetary value on human life. It acknowledges human life, indeed all life, as sacred. And this is why, as Arendt points out, the only morally reliable people are not those who say this is wrong or this should not be done, but those who say, I can't. The greatest evildoers are those who don't remember because they have never given thought to the matter. And without remembrance, nothing can hold them back, Arendt wrote. For human beings, thinking of past matters means moving in the dimension of depth, striking roots, and thus stabilizing ourselves so as not to be swept away by whatever may occur, the zeitgeist or history or simple temptation. The greatest evil is not radical. It has no roots. And because it has no roots, it has no limitations. It can go to unthinkable extremes and sweep over the whole world. There are streaks in my lungs. Traces of the tuberculosis I picked up around hundreds of dying Sudanese during the famine I covered as a foreign correspondent. I was strong and privileged and fought off the disease. They were not and did not. The bodies, most of them children, were dumped into hastily dug mass graves. The scars I carry within me are the whispers of these dead. They are the faint marks of those who never had a chance to become men or women, to fall in love and have children of their own. I carried these scars to the doors of Goldman Sachs. I placed myself at the feet of these commodity traders to call for justice, because the dead and those dying in slums and refugee camps across the planet could not make the journey. I see their faces. They haunt me in the day. They come to me in the dark. They force me to remember, and they make me choose sides. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions. So I want to allow a few minutes. So 3 or 4 questions. So because we only have time for a few questions, make sure you can get to the question quickly and that there's a question. Thank you.
I had a chance to see your interview with Cornel West, Dr. West, and I wanted to ask you, how did that develop? Because I was really impressed with the poetry that you demonstrated in that interview. How did that happen?
Well, Cornell's one of my closest friends, and you know, one of the greatest intellectuals in America, because like Julian Benda in his great book, The Treason of the Intellectuals, and Benda writes that, you know, we're given a choice as intellectuals to serve two sets of principles, privilege and power, or justice and truth. And the more you make concessions to those who serve privilege and power, the more you diminish the capacity for justice and truth. And Cornell stands firm. So I think it's a combination of a close personal friendship, and of course, you know, I've been deeply influenced by his work. So I think you're right that you captured that kind of chemistry between us, but also I hope, you know, the deep, deep respect that I have for him.
We have a question over here.
In your opinion, has the U.S. ever thought a war or military action you would say is morally justified?
Not many. I mean, the problem comes down to the Second World War. I just finished a very fine book. Actually, I read it. I finished the last page as I was landing at the airport in Omaha by Adam Hochschild, To End All Wars. And it's about the socialists like Hardy and Bertrand Russells and others who stood up against the suicidal slaughter of the First World War, and Eugene V. Debs in our own country, all of whom went to prison for this. You know, at the signing of the Versailles Treaty, there was a British cabinet minister, Milner, who, when Wilson was saying it was the war to end all wars, he said this is the peace to end all peace. And you know, that's why history is so important, that the utter humiliation of Germany, the seizure of much of its territory, the draconian reparations that it forced it to pay, you know, vomited up the Nazi Party. I mean, I'm not a pacifist. I was in Sarajevo during the war. We were surrounded by the Serbs, 3.5 years, 2,000 shells a day, constant sniper fire, 4 to 5 dead a day. It was a trench system. It was like World War I. And we knew that if the Serbs broke through those trenches, a third of the city would be slaughtered, and the rest would be driven into refugee and displacement camps. And that wasn't conjecture. That's what happened in the Drina Valley. It's what happened in Vukovar. And so there do come moments when, both as an individual and a nation, there are forces that seek your annihilation. And so, I mean, my father was a sergeant in North Africa in World War II, but came back from the war virtually a pacifist, having, you know, seen what combat did, and was a fierce opponent of the Vietnam War. In fact, when I was about 12, he told me if the war was still going on when I was 18, he would go to prison with me. And to this day, I still like carry this image of sitting in a jail cell with my dad. I mean, I think the real issue, which I mentioned before, is those who profit from war. That the profit motive has to be taken out of war. The defense industry has to be completely nationalized. And that will go a long way to curbing war. But, I mean, fascism had to be stopped. I mean, Orwell went and fought in the Spanish Civil War. I mean, most American wars are about the extraction of resources, the subjugation of populations, and theft, subjugation, and profit. I mean, you know, it's the oil in the Middle East. There's a reason we're not in Uganda. You know, in 1898, we took over Cuba and carved it up like a huge plantation. And I know, because part of my family, not my direct family, my father's family founded East Hampton, New York in 1650, but a branch of that family was the largest landowner in Cuba. And so the American imperialists went in there, and the businessmen came and took it over. That's what war is. It's a racket, as Smedley Butler said. So, but I have seen the capacity for human evil. I have seen that there can arise forces bent on your annihilation, and nobody was sitting around in the basements in Sarajevo during the shelling talking about pacifism. So whether we will ever eradicate war, I mean, certainly, I think what Will and Ariel Durant calculated, there were 7 years in all of human history where there wasn't a war somewhere. But I think taking the profit motive out of it will help. Probably bringing back the draft. I mean, we should have never gone into Iraq. This was just a disaster. And when we look back and see what we squandered, not only in terms of money, but in terms of the direction of scientific and technological expertise towards war, as opposed to addressing what is the mortal threat we all face, which is climate change. So, but yeah, most wars are about, especially imperial war is about expanding profits. Always has been and always will be.
I just wanted to ask, my disconnect seems to happen when I tell or try to tell my friends and loved ones about your writings, and they don't view the corporate control as being the enemy. They view the immigrants as being a drain on this. They view everything. So I don't see them joining in this.
Right, and they won't,
blame
because,
you wrong.
so I wrote a book a few years ago called American Fascists, the Christian Right and the War in America. I was trying to reach out to them. And part of my anger with the liberal church is that we didn't do our job, which was denounce these people as Christian heretics. You don't have to spend 3 years, as I did at Harvard Divinity School, to understand that Jesus did not come to make us rich. And Jesus did not come to bless the dropping of iron fragmentation bombs over whole swaths of the globe where people think and believe differently than we do. And we gave them credibility when we shouldn't have. One of the things about that book was how much empathy I actually had for the people sitting in the pews. Not for the mega preachers who, for them, it's a racket. I mean, they're raking in money. Pat Robertson's net worth is estimated at $1 billion. But the kind of despair that they were in. I would do interviews, and they had struggled with substance abuse, often familial, domestic violence, sexual violence, bankruptcy, chronic, and, so they retreated. All totalitarian systems, as Hannah Arendt points out, are about magical things. They retreat into magical Jesus. And the prisons, they love it. The prisons all send these evangelical ministers in there and say, it's your fault you got in here, but now Jesus will save you. Well, of course, when they walk out the door with a felony conviction, Jesus isn't going to get them public housing or food stamps or a job or anything else. And so what we've done is, and this is what proto-fascist movements always do, is that they direct a very legitimate rage towards the vulnerable. So it's, it's the fault of Muslims, it's the fault of undocumented workers, homosexuals, feminists, liberals, intellectuals. And that is a very strong undercurrent. You see it in Trump rallies. I mean, that is what is drawing. And I walked away from that book on the Christian right. You can't really have an argument with somebody who believes that, the story of the creation of the world in Genesis is historical fact. I mean, even in that story, it's non sequiturs. God creates light on the first day and the sun on the fourth day. I mean, the writers of the book of Genesis thought the earth was flat. You're just not going to go there, because if you shatter that magical world that they've created, they are pushed back into the world that almost destroyed them, which is why they love those apocalyptic. I went to an end time conference in Detroit, appropriate city to hold it in, with Tim LaHaye, and it's like it was just ghoulish in terms of what would happen to the world out there. And so I walked away from that book believing the only way we're going to break the back of this proto-fascist movement, which is frighteningly large, is by reintegrating these people back into the economy and giving them a place, which is why I'm a socialist. I believe in full employment. I think John Paul II, who wrote a great encyclical on work, had it right. Work is not finally about a wage. It is about self-respect. It is about contribution. It's about a place. It is about dignity. And, of course, we're spinning off in the other direction. And this nihilistic violence that we saw is a symptom of a society that's breaking down. It's the same. I look at ISIS as nihilistic. I look at these alienated, often white men, we don't know the ethnicity of this 20-year-old shooter, as those who've been, and I think we have to radically rebuild a society where people have a place. And if we don't do that, I mean, because the corporate coup, what it's done, in essence, is created a government that's paralyzed, in the sense that you have a tiny cabal that serves the interests of an elite, an oligarchic elite, and ignores the citizenry. I mean, Princeton, 2 university professors at Princeton did a long study looking at legislation, and they said, you know, what the average citizen wants, it makes no difference anymore. And that's extremely dangerous. That's what happened in Yugoslavia. So, which I covered the war there, as I mentioned. The war was caused by the economic breakdown of Yugoslavia. It wasn't caused by ancient ethnic hatreds. And I was with a battalion once of the Dudakovic's 5th Corps when we were fighting the Serbs, and they all were shaheeds, and the TV cameras they were wearing green bandanas, and they loved it. And so I'm hanging out with this battalion. They find out I'm in the Middle East, and they want to know. And by the end of the discussion, it turns out I'm the only one who's actually read the Quran. So that strain of proto-fascism. I mean, we had the bloodiest labor wars in U.S. history. Hundreds of American workers died. Going all the way back to slave patrols, the Pinkertons, the Baldwin Felts, the gun thugs. Let's go back to 1908. The FBI, the American Legion, was all to burst into, the Wobblies and smash them all over the head. It's there. And that's what frightens me. If we suffer another economic meltdown, and I unfortunately have a couple cousins on Wall Street, whose view of the economy is not anywhere different from mine, but they're just cynical. They just are stealing or looting as much as they can before it goes under. And they're looting staggering sums of money. And I fear, all of these ruptures need a crisis. I mean, in Yugoslavia it was hyperinflation, but they need a crisis. And if that crisis comes, I think it could be very frightening, especially given the proliferation of weapons. I mean, we've largely criminalized weapons for people of color, effectively. But we watched, like with the Bundy thing, all these white extremists. I mean, imagine if they were black, what they would have done. You think they would have let them all walk home? Or if they were from Earth First or something? So I think we have to recognize that America, unlike, let's say, Canada, is a deeply violent culture. We always have been. And that these strains of fascism, proto-fascism, which I think is what the Christian right is, it fuses the Christian religion with the state, which is what the German Christian church did. It's there. But we're not going to rationally convince these people, to come to our side. They're angry and they're enraged, and they have every right to be enraged. I mean, that's the rise of the neo-Confederacy in the South. I was in Montgomery with Bryan Stevenson, the great civil rights lawyer who spent his entire life defending death row inmates in Alabama, most of whom, of course, are black and poor. And we were walking through Montgomery, and he was pointing out all these Confederate memorials, and he said they've all appeared in the last 10 years. And I said, that's just like Yugoslavia. With the breakdown of Yugoslavia, suddenly everybody retreated into this mythic past, the field of blackbirds if you were Serb, or the Croats who openly embraced the Ustasha fascist regime in World War II Croatia. And that's what we're seeing. People are retreating into these mythic narratives, the poor or impoverished whites largely into this neo-Confederate white supremacy. And that's why, but I think the only answer, I know I'm going on too long, but I covered Oslo. I knew Rabin quite well. I knew Rabin and King Hussein and admired both of them, and watched Rabin do what maybe the only time I've watched a political leader do what a real leader should do. When he announced that he was doing a peace agreement, the whole country was against him. Netanyahu was having rallies. They were dressing Rabin as a Nazi, in a Nazi uniform, and burning him in effigy. And after he was assassinated, before she died, Leah Rabin's, his widow, to the day she died, accused Bibi Netanyahu of murdering her husband, which he did. But Rabin understood that the occupation was destroying his country. And he also understood that the only way to break the back of militancy was to give the Palestinians an economic place in Israel. So that if a Palestinian worker came to Tel Aviv and worked in a garage and went home and could buy a refrigerator for his family, he wasn't going to strap on a vest and blow himself up. I've spent months of my life in Gaza. And what happens now that they've shut it down, is that you have these, especially young men, tend to a room. They can't get married because they have no resources. They can't get a job. They can't get out. They're in the largest open-air prison in the world. And so the only way left to affirm themselves is to be a shaheed or a martyr. Israel has shut off we're complicit, every avenue by which they can be something. And Rabin got that. And I think we can look at our own country and realize that we must create mechanisms by which people are allowed to live with their dignity. I mean, one of the crimes of mass incarceration is that those people of color trapped in these internal colonies because of poverty, they can't get out. With manufacturing gone, they are, as Marx said, surplus or redundant labor. They don't generate money for corporations on the streets. They generate $50,000 or $60,000 a year if they're locked in a cage, which is why poor people are locked in cages. For the private phone companies that charge 4 or 5 times what we pay, and those phone companies are evil because the only connection children have with their incarcerated parents is through the phone. Now we're watching 1 million prisoners work for for-profit corporations. Starbucks, Hewlett-Packard, Johnson & Johnson, huge list. McDonald's even. Victoria's Secret. And the commissaries, which are prices have all gone up by 100%. In Alabama, you're not paid. In New Jersey, you're paid $1.30 a day. They don't issue things like shoes. You come into a New Jersey prison, you're barefoot. You want shoes, you have to pay $45 for a pair of Reeboks. If you're living off your salary in the prison, you're only making $28 a month. I mean, it's insane. And you watch what these corporations do to the poorest of the poor and the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. And you see, which is kind of why we wrote this book about sacrifice zones, about what they'll do to the rest of us. We're in their eyes, we're all one big sacrifice zone.
Yeah, we just out of respect for everyone's time tonight, and you can see that he doesn't have simple answers. He gives us the $1 million response, and we really appreciate that. So please join me in thanking again Chris Hedges for his time. Cynthia's going to lead you out. If you can remain standing for just a moment, we're going to allow Chris some time to get out to the table because some of you will be wanting to purchase books or brought your own books and want him to sign your books tonight. We do have cookies and coffee for you. Also, if you would take a moment, we have some evaluation cards by the ticket counter. We would appreciate those tonight. Thank you so much for coming, and we hope to see you at future events.